Hello and welcome to Addicted to Lacrosse. This is episode 1.23, 23, I guess, for Sunday, June the 1st, 2014. Hope you are joining us at our augmented time instead of Monday night. I'm not available Monday night, so we're doing the show on Sunday instead. My name is Graham Perro. With me, as always, or as usual, as we say, is Tyler Fitch and Melissa Daphne. You can ask us some questions if you like. Our Q&A app is running. The easiest way to find it is facebook.com/laxpodcast, and then you can find our Google Plus page from there. No big news this week. Kind of nothing interesting happened in the NLL other than the end of the season. I had the good fortune to travel to Rochester for the final games, and so I will give you a few of my thoughts about the Rochester victory. And before we go any further, I wanted to show my Rochester jersey, which I was going to wear during the show, except it gets kind of hot in here with the door closed, so I took it off so I wouldn't sweat buckets during the show. But I do have some signatures. Scott Campbell, number 37, Rochester forward, number 51, Sean Williams, and this was actually done a couple of years ago, and some loser backup goalie named Aaron Bold. So those are my Rochester signings, only one of which is actually on Rochester now. Anyway, like I said, I did manage to get to this game. I was in the second row, right next to the Rochester bench. There were literally 3 seats next to me, and then the bench. When I bought the tickets, I thought this is going to be awesome. I'm going to be able to see everything. And at one end of the floor, that was absolutely true. I could see everything that was going on there. The other end of the floor, unfortunately, all the Nighthawk players stand up while things are happening, so I couldn't see anything at the other end. So you guys probably got a much better view of what was going on for what was for me the far end of the floor for about half the game. So they did show it obviously on the jumbotron, so I got to look at that, but it was kind of grainy, and there was the plexiglass in front of me, so I couldn't see an awful lot from the other end. So I've got some comments on half the game and not much on the other half, I suppose. I thought both goalies played pretty well. Nobody stood on their head, but they were both very, very good. Obviously, the defense has played very well in front of them as well. Matt Vince came up huge during the last few minutes of Game 2, last half of the fourth quarter, and the last half of Game 3 as well. He faced some pretty tough shots with just seconds to go at the very end. And obviously all the pressure was on him because any goal at that point was going to tie the game up and then go to OT. There was one thing I wanted to mention that it seemed like, and I've seen in previous games where the defenses look like they're trying to completely eliminate any shot at all and just let the shot clock control things. So that didn't seem to be happening in this game, in that there were a lot of shots taken through traffic. Now, I'm not entirely sure whether that was the defense's goal, is to say, well, if you want to shoot, you go ahead and shoot, except you're going to have to thread the needle through a whole pile of people in front of the goal. Just saying, well, there's 5 seconds left, we could either dump it in the corner or we could take a shot and hope it gets through. So I don't know which one that was, but that's one of the things that I noticed that was going on there. Yeah, I have a few other things to say, but I guess I'll let you guys start as well. Tyler, why don't we start with you?
It was a great game, about what we expected. We thought Rochester would do a better game at home. I picked Calgary to win, and until the second half, I thought they had a chance. They really came out strong. But home floor and pretty much all the playoff games mattered. Mike Poulin, he got pulled twice. Well, one time he kind of walked off to kind of reset himself. Second time in the fourth quarter, I think he may have got pulled to reset, knowing that the mini game was coming. And that was interesting. They were talking about that theory a little bit. Like, is he getting rested, or is he just kind of getting mentally prepared, or he came back into the game with about 5 minutes left, and they said this is his warm-up for the mini game because it was pretty much out of hand at that point. Watching Dan Dawson play, the question in my mind was, would Rochester have won the first game if Dan Dawson had played? Because he made a huge difference in the second game. And then the flip side is, with Jeff Snyder out and Calgary losing numerous faceoffs, would Calgary have won the second game if Jeff Snyder had played? Because Calgary got out to an early lead, but then they weren't controlling every faceoff to then continue to assert themselves. It wasn't their usual make it take it scheme that they're used to. And so both of those injuries had, I think, big impacts on both games. When you look at Dan Dawson's production here, like retrospectively, what he's done, he could have affected the first game a lot, maybe enough to swing it, and they could have just won it outright. Very good game. I liked watching it. It was just like last year in my mind, is what I remembered. The last seconds of the mini game, shot on Vince, and he gets the save, and the team wins. And that's how close to stealth were last year. Reese Dutch took a shot with 2-3 seconds left. Vince gets the save, and they got the title. And then I don't know if it was Sean Evans, but whoever took the last shot yesterday, Vince gets the save, and then the celebration's on. It was pretty exciting. Melissa, what's your thoughts on the game?
I was definitely a little surprised by a lot of it. I didn't get to see all of the third quarter. We actually watched the altitude version, and they pretty much cut the third quarter. So I only got to see about 5 minutes of that. It was interesting. It seemed like in the fourth, it got to a point where Calgary realized, hey, this game is probably not going to go in our favor, and they just really backed off. And it seemed like they started prepping for the overtime game, whatever you want to call it. And so I thought that was really interesting, and I kind of wonder how much that ended up hurting them in the long run. It definitely was. It was a chippy game. I thought there was some definite cheap shots. There was one in the fourth, I think, that one of the players was hit twice in the head right in front of the ref, and it wasn't called, which kind of surprised me. Actually, I think it was in the third game. But there was a lot of diving. I really don't know what to say about that. I was very caught off guard by how many weird actions there were from a couple of the Knighthawks players, and apparently in the fourth, Vitarelli got called for an off-camera dive. I don't know what happened there, but Jamison definitely had a couple instances. It was very interesting. It was, in some ways, it was really good. It felt like a championship game, and then other ways, it felt to me like the Knighthawks just kind of squeaked out the win. And I hate to say that because towards the end there, Vince definitely was making stops, and so in that respect, he did win it. But both offenses just kind of got weird for a little while. But yeah, it was just weird for me. It definitely made me wonder a little bit about if we were still doing the one and done, how different the Championship Cup game would have been, because one, Rochester wouldn't have been there, and it just really put more emphasis on that second game and the overtime game, almost making that first game completely moot. And so it definitely got me thinking more about that than the game itself, which probably wasn't necessarily a good thing. Did you guys have anything else?
Yeah, Graham, I got a question for you since you were there in person. In my mind,
I did notice a couple of dives as well. Or what?
Oh, I'm cutting you
sorry.
off. Hold on. With a minute left, everybody in the second game, everybody got on their feet and started cheering loud, like celebrating that they're winning that second game. How well announced was it that this was not the title. Like you're winning a game by 4 or 5 goals, and you're not winning the title. You got to play the other game. I don't know if everybody's starting to celebrate the final victory, or if they were just celebrating that they won that game and they get to play more.
I think the Nighthawks crowd is fairly knowledgeable in general. I don't remember there being an announcement to that effect. But I mean, the fans were certainly cheering at the end of Game 2, knowing that they had won and that eliminated yet. But I don't remember anybody jumping up and down and screaming and going completely insane as if they had actually won it. It did seem like most of the people were aware we still have to win this game and then we continue. Winning this game is not enough. So yeah, it did seem that most people were aware of that.
Cool.
And you were starting to...
Yeah, I did mention... and talking about diving, I know there were a few places where some Nighthawks seemed to be doing that, and I saw a couple of similar issues with the Roughnecks as well. I know Sean Evans did at least once, and I think possibly more than once, where he would go down and he was holding his head or holding his knee or something as if he was in serious pain, and then the play moved on, or the ref just kind of said whatever or ignored him, and he kind of looked around, said, okay, well, nobody's calling this, and then he got up and ran to the bench. Now, I mean, we've all had issues like that where you fall, you hurt yourself, you hurt your knee, you hurt your shoulder, whatever it is, and it hurts like crazy for 10 seconds, and then it's fine after that. So it certainly could have been something like that, but it really looked like he was falling, pretending to be hurt, looking around, seeing, okay, I'm not getting anything out of this, and then just not bothering with it. It kind of looked like a soccer play at that point.
One thing's for sure, I think the penalty that Calgary got hit with in the third game really had the most impact on them. It seemed like Calgary came into that period just really strong, and it seemed like mentally they got into that we got to just kill the penalty, and their aggression just was gone after that. And so when they needed to step it back up, it was like the team just wasn't there. Did either of you guys have anything to add to that?
No, I was agreeing with that.
One interesting thing I noticed was that Sean Evans scored the first goal of both games, and Curtis Dixon scored the second goal of both games. And I know that was the only goal that Evans scored in either game. Dixon had a hat trick in game 2. But in both games, it was Evans and then Dixon giving Calgary a 2-0 lead, and then Rochester came right back. Obviously, coming right back in Game 3 was a lot tougher than in Game 2. Dixon scored. It was 4:40 in, so they only had 6 minutes left, not even 6. And then they scored their 3 goals. All the building went completely insane at that point. Just the fact that they hadn't scored for the first 7.5 minutes of the inning lead, the Nighthawks fans seem to be sort of realizing, okay, this could be it, and to get them within 1. And then Joe Walters tied it, and holy crap, did that place go nuts. First point scored again, like less than half a minute later, and that's when the Nighthawks fans realized, okay, now we're leading. There's only a minute left. This isn't over. And I do remember specifically right after Point's second goal, putting the Nighthawks ahead by 1. As they were running back to the bench, the Nighthawks bench were all jumping up and down and waving their arms and stuff. And Dan Dawson was the first guy from the offense back to the bench, and he started doing this. Let's just take it easy. This is not over yet. Let's just calm down the excitement, because there's still a minute left, and this is still the championship game. These are still the Roughnecks, they can still do this. So let's save the celebrations until we actually deserve them, kind of thing. And it kind of looked like Mike Hazen was doing the same thing on the bench, just saying, okay, let's just take it easy now. Yeah, so that actually being really close to the bench for that was kind of interesting, because they could kind of see that kind of thing develop, which you don't generally see on TV.
Yeah, a lot of the camera shots were a little frustrating with this. They were very tight in, so you were really focused on the action. So if those players didn't have the ball, it's like you didn't have any idea what was going on. So yeah, I don't remember seeing anything like that. But Dan Dawson definitely having that kind of a veteran presence who's been to several of the games was probably very beneficial.
All right, I guess that's all I had for the championship game. And we do have a question from Dan Barrow, which I guess we were about to get to anyway. How different would the playoffs have been if it hadn't been for the unusual best-of-2 playoff format? I mean, as you said, Melissa, first of all, it wouldn't have been Calgary versus Rochester. It would have been Buffalo visiting Calgary, assuming they had the single game in the second round as well. And then the Buffalo-Calgary one has been done before. I guess in 2009 it was it 2009? No, it was 2004. It was Calgary over Buffalo. So I mean, obviously the teams are very different. Would have been different, but I imagine the strategies that the coaches would put together would have been quite different as well. And with I guess Snyder didn't really play in most of the games anyway, so his lack of presence, I suppose, would have meant the same thing to the Roughnecks. Except that, I mean, Dylan Evans did a pretty good job on face-offs. I looked it up a few minutes ago. Where did it go? 15 for 28, so he was a little over 50%. In game 2, and there was only 6 face-offs in the mini game, but he won 5 of them. So he did a pretty good job there. But what I was going to say was Jay Thornbarrett on the better face-off guys in the league as well, and he'd probably give Snyder a pretty good run for his money. But with Snyder out of the game, Thornbarrett is probably the much stronger face-off guy. So rather than dominating the face-offs, Calgary probably would have been on the losing end of a good portion of them, and that's certainly something that they're not used to.
I think having Schneider in actually would have had an impact, though, because he's dangerous, because not only can he get the face-off, but he scores a lot, at least a pretty good percentage, to make him a little more dangerous than just your average face-off guy. I think getting it is definitely important, especially when you're in that third game coming down to the wire. That probably would have been very, very beneficial for him. But I think it's the fact that he just can take it down and score that really makes Jeff a little bit more of a factor.
Yeah, Rochester winning 5 out of 6 face-offs in the mini game that they won 3-2. Without those face-offs, they never would have got back into it after the 2-0 lead. Just the same way that the game 2 started, the mini game, all the momentum started off with Rochester, and they could have held on to the ball a little bit longer. Could have changed things up. He's a very valuable asset.
Similar question, also from Dan Barrow. Why did Dawson get MVP when he missed the first game? That's a valid question. I hadn't thought about that. I guess the way I thought about it was Dawson was the MVP of the finals, and that would be game 2 and 3. I don't know why I didn't consider game 1. Was he the MVP of games 2 and 3 sort of combined? Arguably he was. I don't think he was far and away the MVP. I mean, they certainly had a bunch of players that played really well. He did score the game-winning goal in one of them and assist in the game winner in the other one. Excuse me. but you're right, Dan. He didn't play at all in Game 1, so that's that's a bit odd. Now it could just be that we're not used to picking a series MVP. We're used to picking a game MVP. So whoever made that decision based their decision on the games of Saturday night, and kind of didn't take Game 1 into account at all. What do you guys think?
I think the fact that you have a week separating the games is going to make whatever happened in that previous game fuzzy in everybody's mind. And so when it comes down to picking that MVP, it's probably going to be who had the most recent impact. And there's no doubt Dawson was definitely dangerous in that game. He had a very huge impact, and it does make you wonder, if the first game might have been different if he would have been playing. But, with Vince towards the end there, maybe you could argue that Vince actually should have gotten the MVP because he really was a big factor in it as well. What about you, Tyler?
Yeah, as got the trophy that says he was the finals MVP and didn't even play one of the games doesn't make sense. You need to look at the whole series, and it's not fair to the guys that played a week ago. And maybe the voting just wasn't clear because the voters are used to just picking the MVP for the game. And so they saw Dawson get the game-winning goal, and they gave him the MVP, maybe not even realizing that he was going to get the trophy for the whole 3-game series technically. But it doesn't sit right that a guy misses one of the games and he's the MVP.
Yeah, 3 goals and 5 assists is nothing to sneeze at, but it just doesn't, when you think of somebody who,
I did see on Twitter.
Wow, you're the MVP for the entire series. Go ahead, Graham.
I did see on Twitter that people were talking about who the stars of each game were, and I guess the NLL does the 3-star thing, and I think they mentioned Craig Point of one of the games and Joe Walters of the other one. I don't remember there being any kind of announcement at the arena of who the 3 stars were. I don't remember them saying that at all. The only indication there was when he gave out the MVP award to Dawson.
I'm checking the score sheet for.
All right, we have one more question, also from Dan,
score.
And we kind of touched on this earlier. Should Rochester be fined for the blatant bad sportsmanship, i.e., diving and hits on key players? I don't know. I saw some dive. I didn't see any significant difference between what Rochester's diving versus Calgary's. Maybe, like I said, I could only see half the game. I did see a couple of things that were called as penalties, and I didn't think they should have been. I saw a couple of other things that were seemingly missed. I don't know. Maybe I didn't see much of it, but I didn't think it was bad enough to be worried about fining anybody. And I didn't think Rochester was any worse than Calgary at that. Melissa, you mentioned this earlier. What do you think?
It's definitely one of those kind of touchy subjects, and the camera angles, things like that, can definitely have an impact. I think that a couple of the Rochester Knighthawk players were definitely caught on camera with some blatant, on par with what Jameson did last week type of stunts, and so I think that's kind of where you get that going, and you're going, wait a sec, what? It's one thing to get the diving. Gouze was a horrible diver. I'm amazed that he continued to try because it never seemed to work, but he definitely was a huge diver. It was like anytime he went down, it seemed like it was a dive. So it's definitely one of those things that I think once you get a rep for it, it's going to hurt your team in the long run, because even when you really are injured, the refs aren't going to take you seriously because they've already seen you, cry wolf a few too many times. The fines, That's touchy. I mean, this isn't a league where these guys make a ton of money or something, so anytime you're putting a financial burden on them like that, and it can be subjective sometimes, yeah, I don't know. What about you, Tyler?
I wouldn't say it was fine-worthy. It felt to me like Rochester was teeing off on Sean Evans any chance they got because he is the quarterback of the offense. So you disrupt him, you disrupt the offense as a whole. And they got the game 2 win, I think, because they just beat down Evans as best they could within the rules of the game as they were being applied that day. I mean, the refs are going to look for a little bit more to call a penalty in a championship game. It's just kind of all sports historically. You really have to do something bad that if the refs want to be blowing the whistle and having their choice impacting the game versus the player's play. So Rochester, I think, took advantage of that and just worked on little Evans as best they could. And it worked out to their advantage. They got the wins. But no fines. But it looked brutal to see the guys just constantly hitting the ground, even behind the play or off the play. Usually they'll kind of slap at each other and give little kind of cross checks, but guys ending up on the ground, that's a little more hitting than usual.
Well, and there was definitely one play. I mean, it wasn't. Maybe it was played up a little bit by the Rochester guy, but there was definitely one play where the Calgary guy really slammed him into the boards at the end of the field, and there was definitely no call. And you could have seen that one maybe, but like I said, maybe it was a little on both sides. Like he just pushed him, and it looked worse on screen than it did. But yeah, it seemed like it was getting chippy there for a little while, and I felt like the refs actually were calling quite a few things, unlike the previous week, which I'm sure had its own impact on the gameplay.
So thanks to Dan for the questions, and one more thing I want to mention: the fact that Sean Evans used to play for Rochester kind of came into it. I don't know if they mentioned this on the broadcast. I mean, obviously the fact that he played there is well known. I don't know if they talked about that fact on the broadcast, but I've certainly seen cases where fans are a little more forgiving to former players in that. I remember Colin Doyle coming to Toronto, and he scored a nice goal, and he got a big round of applause when he was playing. But he was playing for the Stealth. Other players that had played a lot in Toronto, they kind of get not so much cheered, but they're kind of given a bit of more leeway than other players. That was not the case with Sean Evans in Rochester. They didn't seem to have that kind of affection for their former player. And I mean, Evans is one of those guys that you've heard of described a million times as you love to have him on your team, but you hate to play against him. And I think the Knighthawks fans either have discovered that since he left or always knew that but didn't say anything about it because he was on their team. Now he's on the other team, and all those things that he does that are maybe questionable used to be, well, they're for the Knighthawks, so we'll kind of let it go. But when he's doing it for the other team, they're not too happy about it. So he was not given a warning.
Yeah, Evans definitely seems to be one of those very polarizing players. So I could see that having an impact when he's playing his former team. Did we have anything else we wanted to add?
Okay, I guess that's it for the games. One other thing that we were going to look at was changes for each team for next season. What do we think they need to do? I've put together a few things for most of the teams. I didn't do everybody, and I just kind of did this while sort of kind of off the top of my head and kind of looking over some stat sheets and stuff. So I didn't look in too much detail. Barring retirements or injuries or things like that, I figure Rochester, Edmonton, and Calgary could probably all stand pat, and they'd be fine. They have no glaring weaknesses on offense or defense or transition. Their goaltending is fine. All that kind of stuff is all good. So I assume those three will make minimal changes in the offseason. I'm going to start with Toronto because that's my team. I think offensively they're okay. If Brandon Miller, as far as I know, signed a 1-year contract, so he's basically done now. Assuming they re-sign him and keep Nick Rose, I'm okay with that as a combination. I have to say I wasn't 100% confident with Rose in the net. I was never a get rid of him as soon as possible kind of guy, which a lot of people seem to be. But with him and Miller sort of alternating, I'm totally okay with that. So that's good. Defense is where they need some help. They need some bigger people. They need more size. They need more grit. Not necessarily just big, dumb fighter kind of guys. Smart grit, I think, is the way I thought about it. I mean, there's times when you need the gritty players out there to take a penalty. Maybe not specifically to take a penalty, but to do stuff that may end up with a penalty. And sometimes that just needs to happen. But they also need to be smart enough to know when not to take a penalty. And we have enough of the first kind, we don't have so much of the second kind. Scott Johnson's out there, and he's a gritty player, and he played, I think he had his best season ever. No, he's only had 2 or 3, but I wasn't as big a fan of him in his first year as I was this year. I thought he played a much better game, but he also tended to take some dumb penalties now and again, and that needs to go. And it wasn't just him; it was a few other people as well. But Damon Edwards is one of those kind of players where he'll make brilliant plays, and he's a huge asset on transition, and then suddenly he'll turn around and do something totally boneheaded and take a penalty at the worst possible time. So I mean, he's a young player as well as Johnson. So as they mature, they'll hopefully stop doing that. So that's what the Rock need, is more help on defense. Let's go to Minnesota. This has been true for a year now. They need somebody to replace Benesh. Their defense seemed to be okay. Their goaltending seemed not bad, but offense was their big problem this year. And I think they need some more veterans. I mean, they have Callum Crawford, they have Mike Hobbins, but they just got him this past season. They have Jeff Gilbert, and I think at one point Gilbert was the only player on the team over 30. I think Hobbins is over 30, and they may have somebody else now, but that was it. Even Andrew Suter is the captain. You just barely call him a veteran. He's only got 4 seasons under his belt. They need some more leadership. Not that I have a problem with Suter's leadership. I think they just need some more veterans, more people who have been around for a long time. So that would be my suggestions for Minnesota. Tyler, it looks like you had some suggestions as well. Let's go with you.
Yeah, you on Minnesota, you mentioned replacing Benesh. I think Logan Schuss started to get there towards the end of the season. He just didn't start strong enough. Some second-year players really, I feel like they disappeared, like Kyle Matisse. Jordan McIntosh, I don't know if he was second year or third year already, but his numbers were off. And I can't pinpoint, I don't know if because the rest of the league figured those guys out, but they were scary to kind of think that we're playing against them when they were on 2 years ago, and then they kind of just drifted away this season. Need to get them, light a fire under their butts or whatever to get them up to the production level they were at before, and they'll have a better season. So it'll be interesting to see. I don't think they have any reason to get rid of those guys. They just need to find the motivation to get them going better.
Okay. Moving on, I guess Philadelphia would be the other team that I took a look at. Offensively, I think they're okay. They were kind of middle of the pack of scoring. And one thing that was interesting, if you look at their top 5 scorers, their numbers are pretty similar to Edmonton's top five. Like they had nobody in the 90, 95, 100 point range. They had a couple in the 70s, one in the 60s, a couple in the 50s, and then down in the 30s. And Edmonton was not much different than that. I think they had a few more in the 50s, but they were still like the number 6 and 7 scorers. So, and Edmonton obviously proved you can be successful without a super awesome stud, offensive player. But only two teams in the league, Colorado and Vancouver, gave up more goals than the Wings did. Evan Kirk was good, but not outstanding. He was about 7th among starters in both goals against and save percentage. So some of that is going to be on him. Some of it is on the defense in front of them. They had a whole bunch of players that were field players that were making their box debut. And some of them, like Garrett Thule, had really good seasons. Others didn't. I didn't watch enough of the Wings to really know for sure who on the defensive end of things had good seasons and who didn't. So I don't really have any specifics on that. But obviously they need to work on their defense. And just going by history, they're probably going to replace at least a third, if not half, the team over the course of the offseason anyway. They seem to do that every year. I guess a big question for them would be, are all of the American players who didn't play this past year because of the Worlds coming up coming back? So guys like Paul Rabel and Max Siebold and 5 or 6 others, I think there were. The Wings lost a bunch of players that just took the entire season off. I don't know if they're coming back. I don't know if the Wings said, hey, you bailed on us last year, so you're gone. Or if they will say, yeah, Paul Rabel, come on back. We'll do whatever you wanted us to do. So that's going to be a big question mark for the Wings as well, I think. And I left Vancouver and Colorado for you guys. So, Melissa, why don't you give us your thoughts on the Mammoth?
That's definitely a tough
Anybody else
one.
you want to talk about, too?
That's definitely a tough one. Because, like the Wings, the past several seasons, the Mammoth have definitely gone through almost a complete overhaul, which in some ways probably has kind of hurt them in the long run because you just don't ever get that chemistry. I think we're going to see at least a couple players probably retire. I don't think John Gallant probably has another season in him, which is, I'm sad to say. John Gallant's been one of my favorite players for a very long time, and I think his leadership definitely has an impact on the floor. But the Mammoth defense definitely needs some changes. I think that was an area that they struggled. But on the other hand, if your goalie and your defense can keep the other team to 2 goals, but your offense can't even score 3, it really doesn't matter. And there was several games where the offense just didn't produce. So on paper, we have this just all-star team, and maybe that's the problem, is that they played like an all-star team most of the season, again, and they just never really played as a team. I mean, when you look at the Mammoth on paper, they're just, what would you change? Everything is just so strong, but when they actually play, they just really struggle. And they had some really great games, and they had some really, really bad games. So I think we're probably going to see some defensive changes. We're probably going to lose Gallant, and I didn't mind who. I doubt we'll have Carlson back. I'm still surprised that he was on the team. I had it in my head the other day who I thought was going to be retiring, and I'm drawing a blank now. Now that I actually need that to come forth. Overall I agree with a lot of what's been said so far. I think Toronto's defense definitely was an area that they struggled. Their offense is pretty strong, but they definitely had some hit or miss. Rochester, Edmonton, Calgary, I expect will only make a couple very, very small changes. They did so well this season, it's hard to see them really making something that would drastically alter the team. Minnesota, maybe a lot of it was the fact that most of them didn't know if the team was going to be around next year. That, they weren't even sure if they were going to have the team for all of this year. That maybe some of those players just kind of lost the will to play. I don't know. The youth, I definitely think, had an impact. I think having some veterans on there would be good, but, Edmonton overall is kind of a young team too. Philly, I expect, probably is going to make some big changes, as well as Vancouver. I think Vancouver definitely has a strong base, but just like with the Mammoth, something just isn't clicking, and so you're definitely going to have to change something up. I don't expect that Buffalo will probably be making a whole lot of changes. I think overall they did pretty well. You really have to look at what happened with that second half skid and probably analyze that. Was there more intentional, which I can't imagine, thoughts behind that, but there was a lot of things working in the first half. Maybe they just peaked too soon. I don't know. What about you, Tyler?
I like your description of the Mammoth team and how you would apply it to the Stealth. That, like, on paper, the roster looks pretty good, but no cohesive execution of game plans was happening. They don't have the best players at every position, out in my mind, outside of the righty shooter with the Restouch, but the potential is there for everybody to do their job, and they would be just fine. And they did it like 3 games this year, and they looked great. And then the other 13, it was not great. I'm trying to think. I see more personnel turnover on defense is likely. Kind of gets to me personally as I think about Curtis Hodgson. Probably going to be, if he doesn't retire, it'd be a tweener to get on next year, as they need to get faster on defense, and he's getting older, so he's not going to be as fast. He's been there since 2005 when I started following the team, so that's a hard one for me to think about. Jeff Molesky, he's a phenomenal player, but I'm not sure that the travel for him, he comes from northern BC, so he's not able to be there during the week and be with the guys, and maybe that'll weigh in on stuff. Lefty shooters, I don't want to see Lewis Ratcliffe back. I mean, he, as a whole for the season, he did not produce what they're paying him, and I wouldn't care if they change that role out to somebody else and try to find some young lefty shooter, either give more authority to Cody Bremner to go, or Jamie Lincoln to take that role, or whatever. But I just didn't see that he helped the offense. But like, the transition seemed all right. Ilya's left-handed bringing up, Tyler Garrison right-hander coming up the other side. Pretty good guys to have in transition. Kyle Sorensen I worry about as mentally and as on the field leader. He's as good as it gets, but health-wise, he missed over half the season with injuries. Can't have the team have a guy come and go like that and be consistent all season. So I got a lot of worries about what the Stealth roster is going to look like, and how they can fix some of the problems they're having. There'll be some change there. Everybody else, I think you guys summed up just perfectly, and I feel the same way across the board. What do we got next, Graham?
One other thing that I didn't talk about, Melissa touched on the Buffalo Bandits, that I managed to completely forget about them in my list. And I guess the biggest question there obviously is John Tavares, and if he will retire or if he will play another year. He's basically been going year to year for about 4 or 5 years now, and every time the season finishes, we all say, okay, have we seen the last of John Tavares? And then at some point they say, no, well, he'll play one more season, and then we'll see what happens. And he plays one more season, then he plays awesome, and then they do the same thing again. So, I mean, this year he had 51 points, 24 goals, was 4th on the team in scoring. He's not used to being that low, I imagine, other than in seasons where he hasn't played the full season. Now, he played 16 games out of the 18. It did seem like there was more of a send-off this year, that the assumption that he wasn't coming back was a little higher than it had been in previous years. Now, maybe that's because he's 45 and they just figure the odds of him retiring after each season go up as the seasons go on, or if he actually finally acknowledged the fact that it might happen soon. In previous years, he kind of said, yeah, I'll retire when I can't play anymore. and that's sometime in the distance, and let's not talk about it. This year, he actually did acknowledge, okay, it is getting harder. It's getting significantly harder to recover and to get to the practices and all this kind of thing as he gets older. He did acknowledge that it may happen sooner rather than later. They haven't made any kind of announcement or anything to that effect, so we have really no idea. But if they do lose Tavares, that's going to be obviously a fairly big issue. It's not going to be an issue as it might have been a few years ago when he was getting 100 points. But 51 points in 16 games is still significant. So does that mean they play Aaron Wilson more than 8 games? I don't know if that was a choice of his or something that they did. But Wilson only played half the season. Jamie Rooney only played 11 games. So they may just sort of try and get more playing time out of those guys, or they may try to trade for somebody, another shooter to replace Tavares. Yeah, so that's the other thing about the Bandits. We do have another question from Dan. Any speculation on next year's playoff setup? Are they sticking with the best of 2? My only speculation would be that there seem to be a lot of people who liked the excitement of the mini game and the best of 2 format. Personally, I've said this a number of times. I would prefer to see a best of 3, but it's less likely to happen in the NLL than it is in baseball and hockey and such. I think this is a pretty good compromise between a single game elimination and a best of 3. There's no question the mini game itself was really exciting, all 3 of them actually, and it seemed to be everything the NLL wanted from what they were trying to do. I mean, it got everybody excited. It was more likely, I think, in a multi-game series to have the better team actually advance. Edmonton may argue that point. But I didn't see a huge number of drawbacks from it. It does seem to be kind of a polarizing thing. A lot of people either really liked it or really hated it. And I think we have a 2 out of 3 consensus here on this show. But there's certainly no way to know at this point whether they're going to stick with that. My guess is that they will for at least one more year, and then we'll see after that. But Melissa, any thoughts?
Yeah, I think everybody who's watched this knows how I'm kind of feeling about this. I was very intrigued by the idea of a multi-game format for the playoffs and for the championship game, and I think there's potential in it. But I think having this week, drawn out thing really just changes the dynamics completely. I think as a fan, it really makes that first game completely worthless. It's like, why are you even playing it? It just doesn't seem to have that same impact. Maybe that's just because of the way this season's games went. It seemed, for the most part, the second and third games really had more weight. I think if they were doing it, it's Friday one place, Saturday the next, and then if we need, there's an immediate third game, maybe that might do something. But I think one thing that did drive me nuts, and we've definitely touched on this in another episode about the third game, that it's an overtime period that just isn't sudden death. I mean, that's really all it is. Penalties are carrying over, which makes no sense if this is supposed to be a whole new game. They can't make any roster changes because it's not really a whole new game. So I think if they're going to have this third game, it needs to be a third game. Have it 2 quarters or something. Have a half-hour break to let them go back and, recharge a bit or make any changes. I don't like the 10-minute of it. It's not quite an overtime period, but it's an overtime period, and they're not quite acknowledging that, and I really didn't like that. I didn't like the week between games. I think if it was all in one weekend and that determined it, it might change my point of view on that. But the way it's sitting right now, I didn't like this at all the way this ended up. What about you, Tyler?
I don't like the penalties carrying over. That doesn't make sense for a whole new game. But for the size of the league, I think it's better than most of the playoffs I've seen in the last decade. So I do like the format of having the extra game. A lot of players yesterday were like kind of pros or inside lacrosse guys, not inside IL indoor, but just guys who know lacrosse. They were kind of tweeting against it yesterday. That was kind of interesting. They were like, "This is like Mickey Mouse or something like that." But every fan, I mean, not necessarily you, Melissa, either, but there were a lot of people who were like, "What's the problem?" I mean, we know now that Rochester's the best team. Even if they were off on the road, when they came home, they beat them, and then they beat them again. And I think that the format that league doesn't allow for doing multiple games in a weekend and guaranteeing the booking. But maybe if they could, they could come back when they find out what teams are playing and teams are available on Friday, Saturday, they should try and do that. But if like they do that in the West and then the East can't do it, the West gets a week bye to rest up, and it wouldn't be a fair thing. So if they get consensus, like East and West can do Friday, Saturday, just get it done right then. Knock it out of the park. If they can't, then you go for the 2 weeks. It takes longer, but it rewards people. Like I'd still consider the Edmonton rule that they've made the playoffs multiple times in their franchise history and never had a home game until this year. So I think that's great for the fans to give them a chance to get a home playoff game if you're in the playoffs. And so that was nice, and I like that aspect of it. All right, that's all I got to talk about it.
All right. I guess briefly we can touch on our predictions. Not that I particularly want to go there because I was 0-2. All three of us picked Calgary to win. Melissa and I figured they'd win Game 2, and that would be it. Tyler actually predicted a Rochester win of Game 2, and then Calgary winning in the mini game.
Huh.
So Tyler went 1-1. Melissa and I were 0-2. So overall in the playoffs, I was 6-5, and Tyler and Melissa were each 5-6. Yeah, so that was pretty much 50-50 for all of us. Not quite what we did in the regular season, but the mini game made it a little weird in that at least a couple of times we predicted that the game wouldn't happen. So I guess that counts as a miss in that you didn't choose who was going. We didn't actually choose who was going to win. We didn't think it was going to happen at all. So that was, I guess, kind of hard to predict. Maybe if they do the same thing next year, we'll, rather than predict each game, we'll just do a series thing, I guess, the way you do in hockey. Nobody looks at a 7-game series in hockey and says, okay, this team's going to win Game 1, this team's going to win Game 2, this team's going to win Game 3. They just say it's going to be the Bruins in 4 or the Rangers in 6 or whatever it is. Leafs will get swept, that sort of thing. So maybe next year we'll do something like that, and we'll say, Rochester will take it in 2 or Rochester will take it in 3 or something, but not actually specify which games they're going to win. So that's something that we may end up doing next year. Yeah, so I guess that'll do it for this episode. Anything else that you guys wanted to mention that we managed to skip?
Yeah, I'll say that the NLL completely screwed up their postseason awards and that we're wrapping up the season and we have no clue. Just a friendly reminder that that's coming, in August, and it makes no sense.
Yeah, I definitely agree with that. I think a lot of fans are going to completely have forgotten about it by the time it rolls around and decisions are being made.
Yeah, I'm certainly looked. I don't know. I seem every now and again to wonder if I'm an NLL apologist and just say no, whatever they're doing is fine. But I totally agree with this one. I totally agree with you guys on this one. I thought they were actually going to announce the nominees this week before the game, and then wait the 3 months and announce the winners in August, and I totally disagreed with that. Now that they're not even announcing we haven't even got the announcements of who the nominees are, and the finals are over. That makes no sense to me at all. There's obviously fans like us. We're going to be paying attention. We're going to know as soon as they announce the nominees. We're going to know within a day or two. There's an awful lot of NLL fans that said, "Well, there you go. Knighthawks won the championship. Let's turn the NLL off for 6 months, and we'll check them out again in December." And they won't be paying attention to the nominees. They'll miss the actual announcements, and then it'll be halfway through next season, and somebody's going to say, "Hey, who won MVP last year? I don't even remember." Yeah, I don't see the point of this. I don't see why they would wait so long. At least announce the nominees before the playoffs end, so that if nothing else, you announce that the playoffs end, people might think, "Wait a minute, whatever happened with that? We found out who those players were, but now I'm in suspense. I got to find out what's going on." But without that, I think they're going to lose a lot of interest, and the number of people who actually pay attention to the ceremony in August are going to be the media who have to cover it, the diehards like us who are going to watch it anyway, and not much else. So I think they're going to lose a lot of interest in this one. So I don't see the point of that one. So I agree with you guys on that. I guess that will do it. If you've got some questions or some comments or some suggestions for what kind of things we can do to improve the show for next season, please let us know. Feedback at addictedtolacrosse.com. We're on Facebook as well, facebook.com/laxpodcast, or on Twitter @laxpodcast as well. And we will take any and all suggestions, constructive criticism, anything but you guys totally suck. Though if that's the way you feel, let us know. That's good too. So we may record a couple of episodes sporadically during the off season if things happen, if there's big trades or teams joining or folding or moving or anything like that, and God knows that's happened a number of times in the past. So we may record a few shows here and there, things like the award ceremony and the entry draft in September, October, whenever that happens. I can't remember now. Yeah, so I guess that will do it. This has been another episode of Addicted to Lacrosse. For Tyler and Melissa, I'm Graham. Thanks for watching, and we will see you next season.